And hit go. Thank you for joining us for the fourth and final installment of our racial equity series here for California Housing and Community Development. My name is Chris Bitcher, and I will be hosting today's session. Today's session, we're going to be talking about using your spheres of influence. We will be then transitioning at the end of the session to talking about how we apply the things we've learned these last four sessions into day-to-day. What can HCD do to center our work in racial equity? So I will kick the session off to Jeff Olivet, who's going to get us going this afternoon. Jeff.
Thank you, Chris, and it's really great to see all of you again. Nice to see so many faces on camera. I would invite folks who are not on camera to join on camera. Today is going to be a lot more, I think, kind of spacious, room for discussion, room for reflection together. As Chris said, we'll be starting and stopping the video for the parts that we lead, and then opening it up to you all. We'll stop the video and have a conversation. So we really do hope that allows folks to feel like they can contribute in a way that's really comfortable for as many people as possible. Now, having said that, we've been encouraging you all to embrace discomfort in our courageous conversations about race. So we encourage you to continue doing that. A quick recap of where we have come together. This is the fourth in the racial equity series. I know you've also been doing a series with Zita on tribal issues, and these are obviously deeply related, and we hope they've been reinforcing for you all in terms of your learning process around this stuff. First session, we started really big picture. If you remember, we talked about the kind of 500-year history of racism and homelessness on this continent, and really looked at homelessness as a symptom of structural racism. From there, in session two, we went into what institutional transformation looks like, what it looks like to begin moving into an anti-racist stance as an organization. Session three, we talked about personal identity and our own racial backgrounds and how that shapes our worldview, how it shapes how the world views us. And we looked a lot at I just got a note that the host has muted me twice. I don't know if it's censorship. Chris,
No,
I
Jeff,
tell you,
that was
you didn't
me.
like what I was saying.
I was trying to admit somebody, and it jumped and it
That's all right.
you. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thanks. So session three, we looked at things like internalized racism and implicit bias. Today, what we're doing is focusing on how each of us can use our spheres of influence to be a force for change around anti-racism work. And we know that that looks very different depending on the roles you're in your organization, the roles you're in out in your community. The question is, where do you have power to create change, and how are you going to use that power? So as we talk today, I hope you'll be constantly connecting the dots with where your influence is in the world. And we'll talk about this as the session goes on, but really thinking about all of the ways you can create change, big and small, in your work, in your home, in your community, all of the things that you're involved in and all the roles that you play. So that's the work of today. As I said, today's session is, it's less didactic. You'll hear a little less of us, and we're going to want to hear more of you. We've got some information we want to share. We've got a couple of videos that we'll share as jumping off points for discussion, but we really do want to open it up to you all for reactions and for really thinking this through. A reminder of Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations protocol. There are 4 agreements in Singleton's work. One is to expect to experience discomfort. And if you have experienced some discomfort in our conversations over the last few weeks, we feel like maybe we're getting somewhere, that we want to enter into those spaces that are uncomfortable, maybe spaces that we haven't always engaged in conversation with one another, particularly in the work context. So that's a good thing. The way you get to a place of strength in having conversations about race and racism is by moving courageously through that discomfort. We also want to encourage you to stay engaged. And we know that's challenging on Zoom. We know this is the hours 7 and 8 of our training series together. It's a long time to dig into this very complex and challenging material. Don't check out. Be fully present. Bring your best to this learning process. The emails are going to be there when you get back. All the other work that you have to do is waiting for you. Don't multitask. Be here now. Be here with respect for the learning process, with respect for one another, and stay engaged. Third, Singleton talks about speaking your truth. It takes courage to maybe speak when you aren't sure if what you're saying is going to come out right. Sometimes it's easier to stay silent. We all suffer from your silence. We need as many voices as possible to come into this conversation together and engage in real deep ways about this conversation about structural racism and homelessness. That also means you're not expected to speak anybody else's truth. You are not speaking on behalf of a whole race of people or a whole group that you belong to. You are just bringing your own experience to this conversation. Finally, expect and accept non-closure. Even though we will have had 8 hours of training together and you're going to enter into a next step of application with Mary Frances and Alyssa in the next few weeks, we are not going to solve 500 years of racism and homelessness in an 8-hour training series or in 6 months or in a year. This is deep, long, sustained work, and it takes a deep, long, sustained commitment. So expect some questions to remain unanswered today. Expect that we'll scratch the surface on some very important conversations, and that there will be a lot more work to be done. With that, I'll turn it over to Donald to take us into our conversation today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being a part of this series. We have thoroughly enjoyed the opportunity to take you through this journey to active roles in centering racial equity and challenging racist behavior and anti-racist positive action. We really appreciate that opportunity. I was not here on the last training, but I know you were able to watch videos from different groups, MTV videos that really depicted conversations from people in their own experience about race. And we're going to continue that with one additional video this morning, and then we're going to dive into some discussion about it. This video is in that series. It is a conversation with Latinos on race, and it comes from the MTV series. And we will jump into it and then go into discussion.
I think the Latino identity is pretty confusing to me because oftentimes I find it in a little checkbox on a form and I'm confused on whether I should put Latino or Hispanic, but I'm Mexican.
As Latin Americans, as Hispanics in the US, there's a community that gets built regardless of which specific country you're coming from.
And our history is a history of African people, indigenous people, Europeans, conquistadores, all these different people colliding, many times not with their consent. So that informs all these loaded issues people have.
It's like navigating three identities. If you're from the States, you're American, you're Black, and you're Latina. And furthermore, wherever country that you identify in coming from. And that's a lot to navigate.
But at this point in my life, I actually don't identify as Guatemalan, and it's something that I guess a lot of like young immigrants sort of feel, where there's this saying like, ni de aquí, ni de allá, not from there, not from here.
In trying to blend in with the culture in America, I gave up a lot of what I grew up with. Maybe I saw it as something that was kind of shameful or in the way. I wanted to dress like my friends in America. I wanted to talk like them. I wanted to be like them, listen to the same music. I started listening to country music.
I got all these crazy questions like, did you come here in a canoe? And do you know what snow is? And do you live in a hut in Puerto Rico?
I thought my name was Spick until I was about 13. And that was my first awareness that race was an issue.
People say, oh, you look like a white dude. In some contexts, not in all contexts. Depends where I am, depends who I'm with, depends whole lot of things. Depends what language I'm speaking. But however I look, when I leave my name, I can't get a phone call back about an apartment in New York City. And this isn't like 10 places I call. This is like 30.
And I remember telling a kid one time, I was like, let me tell you, the Ku Klux Klan comes here and they see your last name, you're going too, bro. You know? And the kids are like, what are you talking about? And it was like a big thing.
People generally, you know, unless I speak Spanish, you know, people assume right away, I mean, that I'm African American, that I'm black. You know, I mean, it's, you know, just one of those things. It may be the deep voice, it may be the color of my skin.
Because I talk white, I'm not Dominican, or I'm not black, or I'm not Afro-Latina, or whoever people perceive me as of being. And that hurt, and that still hurts.
Because one of my daughters is lighter than the other, they had blackness issues. And I remember my oldest daughter telling my youngest daughter that she was black and that her hair, she said something, and I remember crying like immediately, like, oh my God, no, no, no. And I had to sit them down and talk to them about our roots and that everything that they learned from the family was wrong.
I feel like I wanted more of my culture. You know, I grew up, there was a point I stopped speaking Spanish to her, and I still don't speak to her in Spanish. So I feel like something was lost, and I don't know if it was just because she was busy raising 5 kids and didn't really think about culture in that way and how I would come to identify myself.
Growing up, you know, like this, as you know, as a young teenager, I told people I was Puerto Rican, which is completely, you know, which is right. But at a particular point when I became a little more politicized, I was definitely more of a black nationalist than I was a Puerto Rican nationalist. Maybe because the concept of black nationalism and the black liberation movement is so much more accessible. There isn't a language issue. So yeah, I totally was reading Malcolm and Marcus and James Baldwin and Huey Newton before I read any of the Puerto Rican nationalists.
Either you're black or you're white, and if you're like kind of in the middle, you kind of like don't want to be in the middle. You want to, a lot of us want to be white, but we're still brown. We're still color, you know, we still have color, you know, we're still, according to what the institution is telling us, what race is based on your skin color. So you're like, I'm brown. So that's kind of like where it came. Like, I'm not black. And I'm not white, and I don't want to be white. So I'm kind of brown, and this is kind of like a thing that's there.
If you are closer to being white, you are supreme. If you are not, you are less than. And to me, that's how I've understood it. And that's why I think it's very important that Latinos who look like me say, you identify as Latino, cool. Colombiano, cool. Whatever else. But you benefit from light skin privilege. The fact that you have ojos claros, people want to fetishize that, understand what that means. However much I might want to say, oh my gosh, I'm so special because I have green eyes, you're perpetuating white supremacy by running with that.
I'll talk to a young girl, a young teenager, and she'll say, you know, I'm not white enough to fit into mainstream society. I'm not Black American enough to fit in that, and you know, in that faction of society. And I'm like, but you know what? You're the best person to be kind of like a connector between both, because in you is everything. And being Latino in an American kind of New World way is basically being a physical embodiment of how America began as we know it. So you're every woman. So for me, being Latino is being phenomenal.
So for those who are watching this on video, we just came back from a very rich discussion reacting to that video of Latinos talking about racial identity and ethnic identity. Donald, you just said something that got my attention. You said a lot, you know, every household has these conversations about code switching. Mine didn't growing up because I think the world I was walking into was sort of designed by people like me, controlled by people like me, and made in a way that made my skin color and gender and everything else that I carry around as privilege made my life easier. And so I didn't have to have that conversation, nor did I have to worry about bringing someone back to the house because I'm trying to navigate this multicultural identity or multiracial identity. And so when I was hearing some of you talk and then hearing some of the individuals in the video, where my mind starts going is why is it that that person has to sort of say, I'm neither here nor there? Do I embrace my Latino heritage, or do I sort of try to assimilate? And it just that's the part that makes me really sad in terms of where our society is. And I agree with what some folks said, that we're making some progress in that we can have conversations like this, but it is still a white dominant culture that we're operating in, particularly in the workspace. And I think that the kind of navigation of those multiple worlds, it shouldn't have to be that way. We should be embracing that. We should be celebrating that, and longing to connect and learn from each other and be able to be authentically who we all are. I think that's the world we're striving towards. The last thing I'd say, and the Latino conversation especially brings this up, is just how ridiculous the categories are. And this is true around, census or HMIS data or anything else. When people have to check those boxes around what's a race and what's an ethnicity, it makes your head kind of spin, right? Because it's stupid. And the whole, Hispanic as an ethnicity, and what race am I, and people making assumptions about each other's racial identity based on how they look, or based on a last name, or based on all these things that happen. The categories are social constructs. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The notion of race, the notion of ethnicity, is a made-up concept, and it's made up in order to subjugate some people and keep some people in power. But the impact of racism is very, very real. And so if you don't carry anything else forward from that part of our training a couple of weeks ago, race is made up, race is a social construct, but the impact of racism, the way that categorization scheme gets abused to oppress some people and elevate some people, that's the part that does harm. The categories are stupid. We shouldn't have them, but this is the world that we were born into. So we're trying to both navigate it and make it a better one. The next thing we want to talk about is detour spotting. And I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat here. One is the link to that New York Times video series. So we showed you 2 or 3 of those last time, and today there are a whole bunch of them, and they're really, really great. Those videos are often a good conversation starter. So if you're sharing these with your own organization or with grantees that you're working with, they can often be a good jumping off point for conversations about identity and race. The other thing I'm going to put in the chat is a piece by Jonah Olson called Detour Spotting for White Anti-Racists. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about this now, and then we'll have some discussion about it as well. Jonah Olson writes predominantly to a white audience, but I think there's a lot people of any racial identity can see in this and be thinking about. I'll show you I'll give you a quick tour of the piece, and then I'm going to highlight 3 or 4 of these. So what Olson does is basically say, when we get into conversations about race and racism, often folks get very uncomfortable and end up creating detours. They end up derailing the conversation, either on purpose or because they're clumsy and don't know what to say, and so they say something that sort of takes the conversation off track. Jonah Olson would call these detours, and Olson goes through a whole bunch of these and both talks about the detour and then kind of does a reality check around it, and then the consequence of the detour. So one detour is, I'm colorblind. I don't see color. I just see human beings. And then Olson goes on to talk about that. There's a kind of bootstrap mentality around the level playing field, and if you just work hard enough. There's the notion of reverse racism, that sometimes people will say, by talking about race, you're actually being racist towards me, and sort of flip the script from being the perpetrator of racist thinking or racist words or racist activity to being the victim of it. And there are a whole bunch of these. So I'm not gonna go into all of those, but I really recommend that you all spend some time with that. What I want you to think about, and then we're going to talk about 3 or 4 of the detours, is imagine conversations that you've been in about race. Try to remember conversations that you've been in about race or racism, and think about the way that people have taken those off track. Think about ways people have sort of made it about something else. One of these, Ijoma Oluo talks about tone policing a lot, where if there's a conversation about race, say, I'll pick on my colleague Donald because we work together a lot. Say Donald and I are in a conversation about race, and Donald gets hot. I've actually never seen Donald do this, but Donald gets mad. Maybe he curses a little bit, which I've also never heard Donald do. But he's losing it. His tone is a little bit rough, and he's saying stuff that stings me as a white person because I feel like I'm one of the good guys. I feel like I'm trying to be an anti-racist, and I start taking it personally. And what I say is, Donald, when you're talking like that, I can't even understand. I can't even hear what you're saying behind it because your tone is so provocative. What I'm doing there is tone policing. What I just did was I shifted the conversation away from the content to something else. It wasn't what was being delivered, it was how it was being delivered. And I pointed the finger back at Donald and said, because you're doing this, I can't hear what you're saying, as opposed to really trying to hear what's behind that tone. Why did Donald get so hot under the collar around this? Why is he so passionate about it? Why might he have dropped the F-bomb, which again, I've never heard Donald Whitehead do. So that would be a detour, what I just did. Jonah Olson goes through 20 or so of these, but I'm going to pick on a few of them. So one of these is I'm colorblind. Are you all seeing that okay? I've been told there were some like weird gray spots above some of my my stuff before, so I'm hoping that's not there in this one. I'm colorblind. We'll often hear this in training where we're doing a training and somebody will say, I don't see color. I grew up believing that we all bleed red. I grew up believing we all put our pants on one leg at a time. Like, these are the things that you hear. We're all fundamentally equal. Now, that's a tricky statement because in many ways it's true. We are all equal, like fundamentally, in a very deep way, beyond our skin color, beyond our nation of origin, we are fundamentally equal. But the world does not treat us that way. The world does not necessarily treat me the same way as it might a person of color on this call. And so for me to then say I'm colorblind, I don't see color, one, it erases that racial identity or racial experience that might be different than mine. It's as if I'm not seeing that person. If I don't see color, I'm not actually seeing that person's experience. So that's one thing it does. The other thing that detour does is absolve me from any responsibility. I get sort of the get out of jail free card because I'm not a racist. I think everybody's the same. If there's a problem out there, it's somebody else, not me. I'm colorblind. So it's a detour. It's a defensive mechanism, which Robin DiAngelo would put under the category of white fragility, to say, I don't see color. Another one that Olson talks about is innocent by association. And the way we hear this come up is some version of, I can't be racist, my best friend's black. I can't be racist, my children are biracial. I can't be racist, my partner is fill in the blank. As if that proximity, as if that friendship, as if that marriage or parenthood or anything else makes it where you don't actually have to take any anti-racist action. You're basically saying, I'm innocent by association with that. And I think I understand the instinct because it's sort of saying, I'm not part of the problem here. I reach across racial lines. I'm raising biracial kids. I, as a white parent, have conversations with my biracial child about police killing black boys or whatever. Like, you can see how people would get there, but where it's harmful is that it is sort of like, I get this pass. I get this pass and I don't have to do the hard work because I've already engaged in these friendships or relationships. Now, it's tricky because this is very personal stuff. This is about often who you're in a romantic relationship with, or who you're surrounding yourself with as friends, or whether you had biological children who are multiracial or adopted children who are of a different race than your own. And so it gets very personal and very sensitive for people. But when you hear people say that, it's often like saying, again, I'm not part of the problem here. I'm not complicit in these systems of racism. We've heard this from white leaders in organizations where over and over in the wake of George Floyd's murder, you would hear a white leader say, my biracial children. Like that's what they're leading with in the conversation. And we've been in situations where you then see you almost can feel the eye rolls even through the Zoom meeting of the younger staff of color hearing this over and over and over from a white leader. So it can be really problematic and derail the conversation in strange ways. Another detour that we see is very common is teach me, please, I'm stuck. This would be a white person who's stepping into a learning process around racism and seeks out friends of color to teach me what I should be saying, teach me what I should be thinking, teach me what I'm doing wrong here. Now, this one too is a fine line in a lot of ways. I mean, Donald and our other colleague Kavita and many other colleagues of color have taught me a tremendous amount about racism and about how to think about this and how my own privilege plays into it. But don't buttonhole people and grab them by the collar and say, I need your help working through this. First of all, maybe that person doesn't want to. Secondly, it may be real hard and real painful for that person to want to talk about. And two, or three, maybe three, go off and do your own work first. Like there's so much great stuff out there. There are trainings like this one. There are great books and articles. There are great podcasts. There are great movies and documentaries, and go do some work. If you don't know where to start, get Layla Saad's White Supremacy and Me and work through it. It's a 20-day journaling process. When people talk about doing the internal work, it's often like, go off and really think deeply about this stuff. Do some personal inventory work. Do some learning from these amazing resources that are out there. Read Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. Read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, but after you've read 5 books by authors of color first. And then come have a conversation with people that you're in trusting relationship with, and do it very carefully, and do it with a lot of humility that this person may not want to be your teacher at that moment. And then the fourth one I wanted to call attention to, and then Donald, I'd love to hear your comments on this, and then we'll pause the recording and open it back up to the group. A major detour is silence. And this is not just white people who resort to silence when we start talking about race. And it's certainly not all white people either. Plenty of folks, even in this group, have been very forthcoming, and we encourage that. When you are silent in conversations about race, whether you are a person of color who has experienced racism and oppression, or whether you are a white person who has benefited from racism or perpetuated racism or participated in racist thinking or behavior, if you're silent, it does a few things. One, we don't know where you're at. You don't know where I'm at. And we start making assumptions. And that's a really dangerous road to go down. We are also diminished by not hearing your voice. We need all these voices at the table. It can't be on people of color to solve 500 years of racism in this continent. It's got to be on all of us. And the way we start moving in that direction of racial healing and of racial equity and of real equality is by engaging in conversation together, by engaging in work together, by engaging in changing our systems together. And if we're silent in that, if we shut down because we're angry, defensive, feel accused, guilty, feeling guilty, sad, afraid we're going to make a mistake, afraid we're going to get called out so we don't ever take a risk, we are all diminished from that silence. And what it does is put a wet blanket on the conversation. And, I know we all have these uncomfortable moments when we're engaging in a training like this, especially on Zoom, because we're not in the same room together. When Donald poses a question and there's just dead silence, and everybody's wondering if anybody's going to talk first. And somebody's got to break through that silence. And that's true when you all are engaged in looking at your data together or trying to figure out how to support your grantees and being more anti-racist in their work. Somebody's got to break the silence, and then we all need to contribute our voices. And that's an invitation, not just for these trainings, but an invitation in the work that you do together to break the silence, step out of your comfort zone, take a risk on making a mistake. And then the flip side of that is we need to have a little bit of grace with ourselves and with each other, knowing that we will make mistakes in this work. I have said so many things that I wish hadn't come out of my mouth in my life, but even as a racial equity trainer and facilitator, I say things that I've been called out on by participants, by fellow trainers who are like, hey, I don't know if you meant this to come out like this, but here's how I heard it. And that stings because I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to be a good anti-racist. I'm trying to be a good ancestor to those who come later. And when I screw up, it's embarrassing. It's shameful. But if I'm not willing to open my mouth and take a risk, then how am I ever going to get better at this? How am I ever going to really be an ally? How am I ever going to really embody anti-racism in what I do? That's a crash course in a very good article by Jonah Olson, just to get you all thinking about these detours. And Donald, I wonder what you'd like to add to this before we open it up to the group.
I think that detours evolve over time as well. I think if Jonah Olson wrote this this year, she certainly would have to list things like critical race theory, for instance, that actually, in many ways, has caught hold in communities who have kind of put the brakes on having these discussions and prevented their children from having these discussions. And I hear new ones every day myself. I was on a call yesterday doing some training. I'm not, the concept wasn't new, but this particular use of a particular topic was new as a detour. So this person raised the Atlanta Compromise. Do people know what the Atlanta Compromise is? It's an article written by Booker T. Washington that basically says that we push, at the time after slavery, African Americans were pushing too hard. They were trying to be politicians and teachers and lawyers and doctors when they should have been tending the fields. And so for most people, most African Americans, that's not something we would agree with. But this person, he also said that there should be peace between people. And that is important, but it isn't that people are working too hard and have too high of aspirations about things. It's that they were prevented from doing it. And even at that time, there was a lot of dissension in the African American community about that particular writing. But this person used it as a detour. He said every time he talks about race, people bring up the Atlanta Compromise. And I had never heard that as a detour before. And the other detour that is kind of on the borderline that we see a lot are tears. When people will start to cry because of their either embarrassment, fear, and what happens at that time, whether it's a genuine emotion or not, is it shifts the whole conversation to that person. And the conversation about race really stops right there, and it gets into that person's personal issues. And again, that's a kind of a slippery slope, but it is used as a detour at times. So we know that they happen often, that they evolve over time, and that they can be very, very disabling to really genuine conversation. I think that we have to be careful that and it's easy to slip into those detours. And the silence is a detour that people of color use at times because they don't want to deal with those conversations. They don't want to deal with whatever trauma is reintroduced when they have those conversations. So Alicia has a comment there, Jeff.
Yeah, why don't we pause the recording, Aaron, and then we'll open it up to some conversation with the group for a few minutes before. For those of you watching on video, we just had another very robust and wonderful discussion. thank you all for contributing to that, and some really important and clearly nuanced points on all this stuff. This is not as easy as just this is a good thing to say and this is a bad thing to say. It's much more, I think, complex than that. Sita made a really good point in the chat about what do you do with all this? There was a question, kind of like, what do you, are there strategies to intervene? Are there strategies to name these detours? And if it's a detour, then how do we get things back on track? And as folks who facilitate this kind of work, and Sita, I know this is true for you too, and Mary Frances and Alyssa and others on this call who are constantly leading these kinds of conversations, it's always a tricky balance to know how much to let something go and how much to kind of rein it back in and say, well, let's get back to the question at hand. So if it's a detour that's going off on tone, for example, to simply say, let's bring this back to the substance behind what the angry version of Donald is saying. Like, let's really talk about what he's saying and not how he's saying it. So there might be a very direct way to kind of get at the heart of that. Around silence, I think we can ask each other. We can say, you know, Chris, you've been pretty quiet during this conversation. I'm really curious what you're thinking about all this. You know, I would love to hear from you. And if you don't feel like you can talk right now, that's cool. But I'm curious what's going on in your head right now. Now, you might not do that in front of 30 people like this, but if you're in a smaller conversation about it, I think drawing people out, and that's true across racial lines too. Like Donald said, often folks of color we work with don't, tired of dealing with it, tired of talking about it. It's exhausting. Don't want to talk about it in this mixed race setting at work. Great. You don't have to. But at the same time, the white folks in the room really need to hear the wisdom that you have to share. And so that's certainly a personal decision about when you choose to speak up. But I think we can invite people into conversation and invite people to step out of their silence or discomfort or weariness, so that we can make progress together. I think when somebody says, I'm colorblind, that first one that we started with, it's really tempting to say, no, you're not. Nobody's colorblind. How can you say that? You know, we live in a racist society. Of course you see color. You're lying to yourself. You know, it's really easy to just get pissed about it and want to just like nip it in the bud. But if you think about what the reaction that's going to generate, it might not be the most effective intervention. What I've found myself saying sometimes is, you know, I appreciate you saying that. I've heard folks say that a lot. And I've also heard people of color say, when you say you're colorblind, you're telling me that you don't see me. You're making me invisible. You're making my experience invisible. And so I think we need to not talk about being colorblind and talk more about how we can really come to understand each other's experiences and how the world has treated us differently because of the skin that we're in, because of the racial identity that we have. And just try to get it back on track. So acknowledge it, push it back to the thing at hand. And so I think what you can't do with detours is just let them go. That's my perspective. And Donald, I don't know if you have any closing wisdom on this before we send folks to the break.
I'm actually going to interrupt just for a second because I think Giovanni's been trying to talk and we haven't been able to get him. Or are you okay, Gio? You're good?
I'm good. No worries.
Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure. It looked like you were
Okay,
trying
no,
to speak for a second.
I appreciate that, Heather. I actually don't see Giovanni on my screen. Giovanni, you must be on the next screen. So certainly when we go to the next breakout, we want to make sure you get a chance to talk if you want to. Donald, closing thoughts?
No, I think we've covered it in quite a bit of detail. I will say that we do train on allyship. We also train on we also train on internalized racism. So, you know, we do have trainings that offer more concrete solutions as well. And I know you'll be getting that with our next two trainers. We do talk about the problem because that's part of the initial training, but we certainly do get into solutions as well. And I think I do agree with everybody that said it's really important to offer people tools. And when we transition after the break, we'll start to talk about that.
So with that, it is 2:34 on the West Coast. We will take a 6-minute break.
We're gonna we're going to start a conversation about spheres of influence. And we know that everybody can't be at the center of the fight when it comes to racial equity and becoming an anti-racist. There's a place in the fight, though, for everybody. There's a place that everybody can embrace in many different ways about becoming a person who is an influencer in their own right, in their own space, when it comes to issues of a world that's changing into an equitable world. So what we like to describe that particular uh, part of the world as is just your spheres of influence. And we take a diagram from the environmental world that kind of explains it in a real practical way. Spheres of influence can be both personal and professional and social and organizational, public and cultural. And this example is from the environmental movement, and it talks about as a cultural a cultural way of being. It's all centered around the person in the middle. It looks like we lost the screen for a second. And on the private level, you can do things like donate money or get involved in causes that are causes that help with racial equity issues. A place where you can have quite a bit of impact in a positive way. Sometimes we know it's not always used in a positive way is in your world of your social network world. You can use your social network to really advance some of the views that you have and that you believe in so that others get the opportunity to see it. I post positive messages, new books that come out, all kinds of things in my various social networks. And I see that as part of my sphere of influence. There's also within the organization, you can be, again, you can share your ideas, be a part of the change processes that are happening now. We know that there's a push at the administrative level from HUD to get people to really take a hard look at racial equity within their own organizations and look to see what happens in their outcomes and how they can change the dynamic of what we see as inequity for people of color. And you can do that very easily in your organization. You can do it in your role within the organization. If you're a director, you can look at your hiring processes and how you can bring in more people of color, promote people of color within your organization and change the dynamic and the conversations that happen in some of the spaces that make decisions about your products. And then you can take it to the next step. I don't know if it's a step up or down these days, but you could become a public official either through an election or get appointed to your local board. I know a lot of people do some really good work on the local level, even in their HOAs. They can start to address issues. I like to talk about in your community, there's those neighborhood watch forums that people get involved in that have some of the most racist behavior I've ever seen. And you can challenge it at all levels, whether it's on the social network, whether it's within the workforce, or whether it's in something as simple as the neighbor next door website that people go to and call everybody that comes to the door, whether they're wearing a uniform or not, a suspicious person. I don't know if you've seen that. I just think that that's a really easy way to start to help to change people's lives. But you can also, in your own life, change some of the cultural things that happen, celebrating ethnic holidays and other holidays from other religions. There are all kinds of things that you can do within your own space to be able to change the world. And that is the start. And it is next door. Thanks, Chris. That is the start to being able to change the world. We can do it a little bit at a time. The place we can do it also is with our families. We know that there are many people in many families, not every family certainly, that have views that are long past ancient. And the way you can really change the world is start to change it from what's inside your own social network and your family. We're nobody's born a racist. We're socialized into becoming racist or having uh, racist views. And the way we can change that is to start at home. But I want to give you an example on video. Uh, this particular video is from Dr. Joyce DeGruy. And Dr. DeGruy has been doing this work for a very long time. She wrote a pretty provocative book, but I think it's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And she basically talks about racial healing and how internalized racism has affected people in many different ethnic groups. An amazing read. But she also has a school where she trains people. So for those that really want to get kind of to the next level of this, there's a number of courses that are being taught now. She has a whole university that talks about racial healing. But here is a prime example of what you can do on a very local level to help to start to make change.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who's a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? Isn't it a nice day today? They're just chatting up. And she says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
So Jeff, I think that is to me a very, very powerful video and a very clear example of how you can use your influence to be able to make change in a what seems like a very small way, but in that example, a group of people were taught a lesson, and so you can certainly do that many ways, and you can do it again within the workforce. You can, be a part of something larger, but you all have a sphere of influence, especially those that lead organizations. And the change isn't something that happens from the outside. It's something that you can start on your own. And Jeff, I don't know if you want to weigh in before we go to the next large group discussion.
Yeah, I would just say everybody on this call has power. And even if you feel like you're somewhere, down a chain of command and don't have power to make change, I don't quite believe it. I've seen too many people at too many levels of systems and organizations be a real catalyst for change. And in fact, a lot of the movement we've seen over the last couple of years within organizations to become more anti-racist did not come from the top down. Some did, but often it was staff somewhere down in the front lines or the middle management saying to their leadership, we got to do better. We got to address this. We need to really confront our own organization's role in addressing structural racism in a different way. And then the organizational leadership comes along. I've seen this in faith communities. I've seen it in community groups. I've seen it in political parties where it's not always the people with the biggest title who are the ones really driving the change. It's people top to bottom within an institution or an entity. So our question for you all, and we'll pause the video here in just a second, but for those who are watching, just consider this. Where does your power lie? Where is your untapped power? Maybe influence that you haven't fully taken advantage of to create change. And then how are you going to use that power? So this becomes sort of a personal power mapping exercise followed by a so what exercise. So with that, Aaron, let's pause the video pause the recording and we'll open. All right, well, welcome back, those of you on video. We're closing out this training series with you all. It's been 4 parts. I think you all have engaged in really important ways in some really difficult material, difficult conversations, some vulnerable moments and vulnerable conversations, and we're yet just scratching the surface. This is our life's work to continue to dismantle the racist structures that have underlay so much of American social policy, so much of what has caused homelessness in this country, and in particular, so much that has caused homelessness at such high rates among people of color. Homelessness is no accident, and it's no accident that homelessness impacts people of color at a higher rate than it impacts white folks. That's a result of the systems that we have built as a nation. The other thing I would say about homelessness is that it's not inevitable. It doesn't have to be this way. The structures that we built, the discrimination we see in housing, the discrimination we see in income and wealth and jobs and criminal justice, it doesn't have to be this way. It's not inevitable. And if this is a system that was built by human beings, then human beings can come together and build a better system, a more equitable system, more fair policies, and policies that result in equal outcomes across all races, ethnicities, backgrounds, genders, sexual orientations. We don't have to live with the disparities that we see, and we don't have to live with the racism and discrimination that we see. You all have immense power, as we've been talking about today. You've got influence that you don't even know. Keep being a force for change, regardless of your role, your title, your job. You have the power to create change. So figure out where those levers are, figure out where that influence is, and use it to its maximum. If you just look around this room right now, and then if you think about other folks who might watch this later, other folks who you will influence, we're not just talking about a few people across California. We're talking about a ripple effect. And Donald and I have the great fortune of working with groups like this all over the country every day. And it's extraordinary to see the energy that people are bringing to this work, the passion and commitment that people are bringing to this work. And we are so firmly convinced that a better world is coming and that folks like you are the ones who are bringing it about. And that doesn't mean it's not going to be bumpy, doesn't mean we won't have setbacks, it doesn't mean we won't face ongoing racism or backlash, but it does mean that we can create change. And if nothing else, I hope we have planted some seeds with you all. I hope we've given you some knowledge, some confidence to be able to enter into these conversations with a fire in your belly about not only ending homelessness, but also ending racial inequity. Donald, do you want to close us out before our friends at ICF take it?
I think I started in the beginning, and I'll just say, I'll be very brief and just say that if you don't take anything else from this training series, please take that this is important work and it's active work. This training series wasn't to check off a box for anybody. It was to really start you down the road to becoming an anti-racist. And hopefully you'll embrace that. And it's not a passive activity, it's active. And I hope you'll move from here into some active role in helping to dismantle racism in this country. I heard people talk about the voices at some of those discussions that were happening in Virginia. Don't be Virginia. If people are in your neighborhood, in your school, on your next door, I know I'm fixated on that. Don't allow those conversations to go unchecked. It's when we ignore dysfunction, when we ignore discrimination, when it's allowed to fester. So if we can be a part of the active change that starts to interrupt those really false conversations, those untruths, those changing of history moments, we can really make change. And you have incredible opportunity to do that within your own organizations. And please be aware that it doesn't matter where you're at in this country, whether it's progressive California or not as progressive Alabama, racism still exists. And we have to be active parts of changing it. So we've really appreciated working with you. And we are leaving you, passing you on into good hands with two amazing trainers. And we look forward to hearing from you again down the line. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Donald. Thank you, Jeff. This is not goodbye. This is more like see you later. Alyssa and I, my name is Mary Frances Kenyon, in case you missed my intro in the chat. My colleague, Alyssa Parrish, and I are really grateful for having the opportunity to sit with you all and listen in, hear from you some deeply personal experiences as you were moving throughout today's fourth and final session with Jeff and Donald. What I wanted to say is that I heard so much. We heard today about identity and colorism, feelings of sadness, and feeling like an entire culture and culture's history has been erased. There were some really vulnerable moments which take a lot of courage. And whether or not you spoke on camera, dropped a message in the chat, this is such a critical part of the process. For those in the room today that were not comfortable speaking or not comfortable sharing, it's okay. You're exactly where you need to be because you have a unique opportunity to listen and to digest and to process. And I hope that as Alyssa and I continue on, we will have the opportunity to gain your trust, and to hear from you, hear your perspectives. I know that unpacking topics that you all have discussed, like racism, is, it can be deeply uncomfortable. Talking about anti-racism can be terrifying. And then looking inward causes anxiety, at least it does for me. And I'm sure that's a shared trait amongst many of you on the phone today. I want to take just a moment to share with you in our final moments before I hand it over to Alyssa, what resonated with me about today's conversation, particularly as I was hearing from you all talking about spheres of influence. Prior to joining ICF, I was working in local government, leading the homeless response system for a smallish county right outside of DC. And I think through that experience, I started to recognize as I was on this racial equity journey, right? Because it's very much a marathon and not a sprint, that I was getting frustrated with my spheres of influence, even though I had a pretty wide net. And what I found was sort of twofold. A piece of it was, being an employee in local government. I don't know if y'all are aware of this, but the state of Virginia up until this year did not allow government employees that weren't a part of public safety to unionize. But we had a 501c4, I can't remember which one, 501c4, I think is what we were able to get. And we met regularly. And we, as things were unfolding in 2019, 2020, we were really wanting to continue on the path of organizing and recognizing that we had some shared concerns across, public servants around, treatment of government employees and around access to folks like at the county manager's office, and just felt like our voices weren't being heard. And as I was doing work in the homeless response system, trying to create more equitable pathways for people to exit homelessness, I kept hitting roadblocks, right? I kept hitting roadblocks. I was searching for answers, stalking people on the national circuit that have been doing racial equity work for years, trying to pull together this regional coalition of, 8 or so continuums of care. And what I learned from that process is that coalition building takes time. Planting seeds takes time. Everyone's in a different space, right? But there are really some practical steps that we can take as individuals and as a collective to make change. Because at the end of the day, there are people in our systems that are getting a short end of the stick. And we have an opportunity, you all each have an opportunity to help level the playing field. You are probably at a point of fatigue in talking about and hearing about some of these topics. But I have to be honest with you, this isn't something that's going away. This is a priority for the current administration, which might go away, but this is the priority of a lot of constituents throughout the country. This is a priority of a lot of fellow administrators of ESG, COC, CDBG, like HOPWA, the whole gamut. This is becoming a movement, right? And we want to be able to help you all be in position so that you can serve as champions for all of the continuums that you touch through the state. So I am looking forward to connecting with you all. I think I'm going to kick it over to Alyssa, who just wants to give a sort of a high-level overview of what the plan is. And I ask that you each just continue on the course with us. We're about to get to the cool stuff, kind of, where you get to reimagine how you interface with grantees throughout the state of California. We get to really help lead some cool change. So I hope you'll hang in there with us. And thank you so much. I'm going to kick it over to Alyssa now.
Thanks, Mary Frances. And thanks again, Donald and Jeff, for today. That was great. Just real quickly, I want to echo what Mary was saying about this feels like a movement. I was in a meeting earlier today where we were focusing on equity and just mentioned in that I really have seen, like I have felt it. I have felt the shift from it being like its own standalone thing that we tie on to like all the other stuff to really being intentionally incorporated into the work that we're doing. And so whether we're talking about coordinated entry, whether we're talking about anything else, funding, rapid housing, permanent supportive housing, like equity is finding its way into those conversations. And so it really does feel like more of a natural thing that we are just bringing into the work because it is the way that we are doing the work. So that is feeling really good. So I think for the next 2 minutes, just at a really high level, talking about kind of the next kind of four sessions that we will have with y'all, with the first one really talking about understanding our team, which is like you. And so really focusing on, you know, how we engage with each other, the diversity and inclusion that we find on this team already, and also how we can leverage the strengths that we have on our team, as well as address and complement each other to look at the limitations. So that's really the first focus, is really understanding internally to our team what we have going on. And then pivoting to the external, doing a community landscape scan. So what specific disparities exist in the communities, probably touching on some data at that point, what data you have available to you. I think I saw something sent to me yesterday around Stella P. So looking at that and breaking that down, not just the data and numbers wise either, but also looking at policies and systems that exist in the communities that interact with the homeless response system, what kind of partnerships already exist, what partnerships need to be built up, and then those historical events that impact current realities. So I think we heard some about Richard Rothstein today and historical redlining, segregation. So that kind of impact and how those have impacted the communities over time. Asset and power mapping will be a third focus. So looking at the power dynamics within a given community, which we touched on a little bit today, not just our own spheres of influence and power, but how that looks at the community level as well. And then the last one is advancing equity through procurement. So HCD's role in that and what that looks like and what changes potentially HCD could make in the procurement processes. So those are the four major topics that we'll focus on over the coming weeks with y'all. And I see that I am now a minute over, so I'm going to pass it over to Chris.
Thanks, Alyssa, and thank you for laying out our curriculum for the next four weeks. I want to thank Jeff and Donald for shepherding us for the first 4 weeks and making the transition to Alyssa and Mary Frances to get us to the point where we can begin to show how racial equity can be in our day-to-day work. And that's what ultimately, when we first got started in this session, that's where folks want to go right away. I said, wait, there's a process. We've gone through that process, and now we're going to get to go into solutioning. I'm really excited about the next 4 sessions because not only do we look internally at California HCD and how we have to, understand racial equity internally, but we're also going to be looking at our communities and how we can influence, have our racial equity lens influence that work as well. So I'm really excited to see that happen. Our next one is on November 17th, same time as this. We will schedule the other 3 in the coming weeks, nail down the times and dates so that we can have all 4 ready to go. And again, just want to thank Jeff and Donald for shepherding us to the first, and thank you all for your time, energy, and everything here today. Usually I try to come up with a nice wrap up that sums up something emotional that I felt, but honestly, I just feeling grateful of all the folks that are here today and all the folks that have stuck with us for 4 weeks, and look forward to seeing you for the next 4 weeks, next 4 sessions. So with that, we'll bid you a good evening.